So religion and spirituality are older than necessarily than Homo sapiens sapiens. So we don't invent religion and spirituality. We uncover it. We discover it. It's already there. It's not a matter of constructing it. But Neanderthal was an evolutionary dead end. Nobody in this room has Neanderthal genes or Neanderthal blood in them. Really. This notion of an afterlife, I want to emphasize that, this notion of an afterlife and a rudimentary spiritual consciousness grows slowly in human experience over hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of millennia. But it only takes a quantum leap thousands and thousands of years ago in Africa, and this is associated with the cult of Osiris. There's a quantum leap in spiritual consciousness of human beings. It's associated with the Osirian cult, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later. But I wanted to just drop that right now. So, very brief background, setting the stage here. All the hominid lines that lead to modern humanity, Homo sapiens sapiens, arose in Africa and were of necessity dark brown to black in skin tone. Partial lines of Homo sapiens sapiens are found in different parts of the world, but the complete skeleton and the complete formations are only found in Africa, and they're found earlier in Africa than anywhere else. Not only was the first human being in Africa, but the entire sequence, not just the first man, but the last man, the present form, developed in an African context. All humanity today is rooted in an African template, and there are only mutations of this form. There's no speciations. There are only mutations. Periodically you'll find someone who will bring up that argument again, and it's just bogus. It's just been ruled out by DNA and genetic analysis. The Africoid type is the root and parent stock in which there are surface variations and phenotypical mutations and adaptations to various ecological and climatic changes. So, most of humanity's 3.5 to 4 million years, however far back you want to take it, 3.5 to 4 million year history as a hominid has been spent in an African cradle of unfoldment. Only about 12% of this has partially been out of Africa. This means literally billions and perhaps trillions of hours of conscious human experience has been in the African context. This leads to what I feel is an African template, the African basis for the generation and the speciation of the human being. This is the case for us morphologically, anthropologically, genetically, historically, and in deep psychic and spiritual ways also. See, the collective unconscious, we hear so much about, is at bottom the African unconscious. And this is the case also not only for African people, this is the case for European people, and this is the case for people in Asia, Japan, South America, and everywhere. The deepest levels of their minds also is an African structure, an African basis to the generation of their own consciousness. This is what's called in psychiatry and psychology the real threatened return of the repressed. Most nations, most cultures fear the darkness, and that's part of why that fear is, because it's the fear of one's own origin, the threatened return of the repressed. I want to talk a little bit about embryogenesis here, because it's important, it's germane to what we're going to talk about next, what I'm going to build on. Embryogenesis is just a complicated word for what goes on with the fetus during development. Embryogenesis. Going from a tiny, tiny fetus to an organized human being. Okay. Embryogenesis from the first hours is guided and organized, this is very importantly, by a very important molecule known as melanin. Okay. There are numerous references for this, but the best medical reference is F.E. Barr in Medical Hypotheses. Melanin, the organizing molecule, came out in 1983. But there are a number of others. What you have is the egg and the sperm unite, fertilize, you have a zygote. It goes into the zygote continues to develop into several stages. And it has 3 levels as it develops. Okay? These 3 levels are the endoderm, and that leads to the development of the GI tract, liver, thyroid, pancreas, and so forth. A mesoderm, at least it has 3 divisions, epimere, mesomere, and hypomere. But the one we're most interested in is called the ectoderm. Okay? From the ectoderm is developed the neural tube and the epidermis. Now, why are those important? The ectoderm gives rise to 3 things. The neural tube, and out of the neural tube develops our brain, pituitary glands, spine, and motor nerves. The neural crest also has derivatives that go to different parts of the fetus as it's developing, guiding its development, guiding its organic unfoldment. The autonomic nervous system, ganglia, the sense organs, adrenal medulla, pigmented retina of the eye, cartilages of the voice box and head, and the epidermal layer that develops some cranial nerves, made a connection, good. Some cranial nerves, smell, olfactory capacities, the inner ear structure, you've been hearing a lot about melanin, the inner ear structure, taste buds, hair, skin, the lining of the mouth and anus, anterior pituitary. It literally organizes the unfoldment. It's like the template of how a human being develops in the womb. And it's developed by a long, dark line, and it's a very important one. The point here is that melanin organizes embryonic development from the earliest hours and days after conception. Melanin is a semiconductor. Melanin, in other words, absorbs light quanta and can transduce it to other phases of energy. In other words, it has the capacity to absorb heat and translate heat into sound, or translate sound into light, or any of those convert back and forth. It's a pretty unusual kind of phenomenon. Melanin may also be a superconductor, for those of you who are interested in physics or have a biological background. It may be a superconductor at room temperature, which is an unusual phenomenon. Still very controversial, and there's a lot of research in that area going on right now. I want to make this one real clear, though. Skin melanin is not the same as neuromelanin. There's a lot of controversy about that, and that's one of the things the media likes to seize upon and blow out of proportion and say that many of us in this community misunderstand. No, we understand it quite clearly. Melanin and neuromelanin are not the same. People in this room have different amounts of melanin in their skin. And if you go to China, generally have different amounts of melanin in their skin, Europe, difference in variations. Neuromelanin is the melanin in the central nervous system. And that's pretty much the same for all human beings. There have not been any studies of showing a significant difference between members of the human family in terms of neuromelanin in their central nervous system. What is interesting about neuromelanin also, however, is that neuromelanin increases as you rise up the evolutionary scale. In other words, different mammals have a certain amount of neuromelanin in their central nervous system. Okay? And you go to the primates, which are higher up in the evolutionary scale, they have each percentage more neuromelanin in their system. And then you go to the higher primates, and they have more in their central nervous system, until you finally get to the chimpanzee, and he has the most, until you finally come to a human being. So that's a pretty tight correlation. And again, if you think about intelligence, or if you want to, cosmic intelligence, and the capacity to absorb information and energy and light from the universe, melanin does that, has a way of incorporating that, transducing that to higher levels of unfoldment while evolution is occurring. Everyone also repeats during embryogenesis, during the time we're gestating in the womb, the same kind of development as our species has had for millions and millions of years. In psychology and psychiatry, this is referred to as ontology recapitulates phylogeny. It's a nice sounding phrase for talking about how things repeat themselves. The history of the race, to some extent, is repeated in the history of the individual. If you've seen fetuses at very early stages, they look like frogs, fish, then they look like mammals, and they're da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. Well, that also happens in terms of human psychic experience also, I believe. Okay. Finally, I want to say that, and I'm not alone in this, that just as in the embryo, there's obviously some kind of intelligence going on, that helps this embryo evolve, because it's a pretty sophisticated